These are truly tumultuous times in federal politics. The past few weeks have seen the government convulsed by scandals surrounding Craig Thompson, the Health Services Union, and the Speaker, Peter Slipper. That renewed speculation over Julia Gillard's leadership. But as we'll see shortly, there are ructions on the other side of the political divide as well. Victorian Liberals are at war amid wild claims that former Treasurer Peter Costello made a bid for a comeback. It's the kind of distraction that Coalition is desperate to avoid as an embattled government stakes its future on last night's budget, which it hopes will shore up its spiralling support and bring disenchanted voters back to the fold. A short time ago, I spoke to the Prime Minister in her Canberra office. Julia Gillard, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Do you think that people believe you when you say that you're going to reach a small surplus by this time next year?
I think we're demonstrating in this budget the real determination to deliver a surplus. What we've done, Chris, in order to have a surplus of $1.5 billion in the next financial year is we've really had to swim strongly against the tide. When we delivered last year's budget, there was around $10 billion more in revenue forecast for the next financial year. So $10 billion in revenue lost, and we've still delivered a surplus. That's how determined we have been to do it. And across the budget, across the 4 years of the budget period, we're delivering $34 billion in savings, building on top of $100 billion we've delivered in the past. So I ask people to look at the figures and to see the determination we've brought to budgeting for a surplus, and we will deliver it.
But the past gives some indication of the future, and last year you estimated a budget that came in $22 billion more than you expected.
And there are a range of factors that explain what has happened in this financial year.
But it could happen in the coming financial year, couldn't it?
But let's look at the factors before we just assume that they could happen in the forthcoming financial year. A big factor, of course, has been this is the financial year in which we've had to make a lot of the arrangements for the recovery from what were the most expensive season of natural disasters the nation's ever seen, the Queensland floods and cyclone, and then the flooding in other states and parts of the country. So that had an impact on the budget. Some continued global turbulence had an impact on the budget. And yes, we did make some very big policy moves, and we were very transparent at the time about the budget impact, like carbon pricing.
Certainly, but the point is it's only $1.5 billion, and unexpected things happen every single year. So why don't you think they will happen next year? And you determined that if they do, that you will continue to cut to make sure you get to that $1.5 billion.
Yes, we are determined to deliver a $1.5 billion surplus, and our strength as to what we're prepared to do to get the budget in the right shape is shown in these budget documents, not only in the figures that I've just described to you, but the fact that when you compare in this budget how much of the economy is going into tax, how much of it is going into government expenditure, we are at lows compared with the expenditure and taxation rates of governments past, including most particularly the Howard government.
If you have to break a series of old promises on aid, on defence, on company tax in order to make new ones, why should people believe any promise?
Well, I don't think you're correct to put all of those things in one basket and pretend that they are the same. On company tax, I wanted to deliver a company tax reduction through this parliament. Of course, I'm not able to do that because Mr Abbott and the Coalition have said they will vote against it.
The Greens said they'd vote in part.
Part of their negative campaign. The Greens were opposed to part of it, and if we'd accepted their proposition, we would have had a different company tax rate for small businesses than bigger businesses, which is dreadful policy, and we weren't prepared to do it.
But why weren't you prepared to at least put it to the test? Because, of course, you know these things can change. You've got the carbon tax through, which must be harder than a 1% decrease in the company tax rate.
Chris, I think I've got a pretty good track record of being able to tell what's going to happen in this parliament, and you're not suggesting to me, are you, that the leader of the opposition, Mr Abbott, was going to wake up one morning, spring out of bed and go, I'm going to vote for that company tax reduction today.
But the Greens have said they support part of it, and perhaps you could have gotten across the line on all of it.
I think, Chris, I don't think you can suggest to me or your viewers that the Greens were going to change their mind either. So the company tax was not going to go through the parliament. I didn't want that negativity from the opposition to deny Australians the benefits of sharing in this resources boom. So we found a different way to do it through increasing family family payments and making some benefits available to the poorest in our community, including people on New Start. So that explains company tax. You've bundled that in with two other saves that have got different explanations.
And all of them were promises that you broke.
Well, defence, a set of explanations about capability
But in 2007, just to
acquisitions.
make it clear, in 2007 you promised that you would increase defence spending 3% every year over and above inflation until 2018. You are not going to do that.
But Chris, what are you inviting me to do, to say that we can go and buy equipment around the world that isn't available to sell to us now?
No, are you keeping that central promise that you would increase defence spending?
As we said on the day that we announced that we would have a new white paper, that we would deal with budget questions for the future in the white paper that will be published next year. But I am going to take you up on describing all of this in the way that you have and putting it all together as if it's the same. Company tax, couldn't get it through the Parliament. Defence, there are a set of explanations about capabilities and when they are available for purchase.
Will you meet the 2007 pledge? Will you meet the 2007 pledge?
Well, I've just described to you what's happened to defence. I went through it in painstaking detail when I made the announcement with Stephen Smith. If you want to talk about defence in detail, let's do it. We're in a circumstance where we want to buy...
I only want to talk about the one particular part. Are you going to go 3% real until 2018 in your spending? So that's a yes, you are. No,
Chris, I've just said to you, and my answer was, and it's the same as what we announced when we announced the new defence white paper next year, that we would deal with budget rules in that defence white paper. Why is that? Well, things have changed in our world since the publication of the last Defence White Paper. At the time, the GFC was just starting. It was not possible for anybody to see what implications it would have for our nation or for the defence budgets and postures of our allies. That's one of the reasons we've brought a white paper forward a year earlier, and we will analyse all of that in the white paper.
And on aid in your UN Security Council bid, and this is something you've talked about for some time, you say Australia's aid program has doubled in the past 5 years and will double again by 2015. That was part of a Millennium Pledge, a pledge you made to the world. And at the bottom of this document it says, Australia, we do what we say. Are we doing what we say?
Well, we're going to be increasing aid year on year. When you look in the budget papers, every year you see more money spent on aid.
Was that the pledge?
Well, we're seeing more money spent on aid. We had to make a decision in this budget to get the budget to surplus. That's the right thing to do for our economy, and it required some tough choices, not pretending any of them are easy. And in a budget where we were looking around the government expenditure for savings to deliver a surplus whilst responding to cost of living pressures for working families, we did take a decision that one save that was appropriate was a 12-month delay in reaching our Millennium Development Goals. What that means, Chris, is that every year of this budget, more money is spent on overseas aid than the year before, and it means that we, who are the 10th best donors in the OECD, will still continue our journey to being the 6th best donors in the OECD. I think that's a record our nation can be proud of.
But to sum up those three things on company tax, on aid and on defence, you're happy that people will look at all those things and take you at your word that you are not breaking any of those promises?
I think people will follow the reasoning I've just described to you, Chris. I think people are smart. You know, Australians are really smart people, and they know there's been a global financial crisis. They'd expect that to have some implications. They may have heard President Obama talk about what he's doing in defence. They may also have heard President Obama talk about his pivot to our region, and they might think to themselves, well, that all seems to have implications for us. I wonder how the government's responding, and bringing forward the white paper is how we're responding. I think they'd look at this Parliament and say, well, if you can't get a piece of legislation through to share the benefits of the boom, is there another way to do it? And we found it. And I'd invite people to judge the overseas aid decision I made. I'm happy to stand by it, but judge it in the context that each and every year of this budget we will spend more on overseas aid than the year before.
Prime Minister, if the central criticism that you had of the Howard years was that they wasted the benefits of the boom by handing out cash in bonuses, why are you doing the same thing?
Well, you look at our budget and compare it with the budgets of the Howard government. You particularly look at the amount that we are taxing as a percentage of GDP and the amount that we are spending as a percentage of GDP. When you look across this budget, we keep spending at less than 24% of GDP. There hasn't been that kind of restraint in a government's budget since around 30 years ago, a run of 4 years with spending less than 24% of GDP.
In handing out this money...
do not, Chris, suggest that you can compare this budget to the days of the Howard government when they were just handing out cash. That is not right and cannot be sustained on the figures.
But if one of the central criticisms of you is that you're driving up the cost of living, you've just delivered a cost of living package, doesn't that confirm the criticism?
Well, I really don't follow your chain of reasoning. I presume you've succumbed to the Tony Abbott fear campaign on cost of...
Well, if there is nothing going on cost of living, why are you giving people
Chris,
more money for
you just said to me you are driving up the cost of living, and I'm making the point to you, to even put that in a question, you must have succumbed.
If the central tenet of the criticism of you is that
let me answer your question. Let me answer your question, and let's just be a little bit reasonable and a little bit common sense about it. There's been a huge fear campaign about carbon pricing. It's affected the community mood. I understand that. People hear all these horror stories about what carbon pricing is going to mean. I understand that makes people anxious. But we are delivering assistance to families for carbon pricing. They're not paying the price. Businesses that generate a lot of carbon pollution are, and millions of households will come out better off. Now, there's that issue. Then there are the rest of cost of living pressures, which are nothing to do with the federal government. So fear campaign on carbon pricing, people coming out better off, many millions of them. Then what else makes up a family budget? Well, petrol does. The rest of the increases in electricity do, which aren't anything to do with carbon pricing.
Some of them are to do with renewable energy programs, though, aren't they?
And many of them to do with the poles and the wires and the distribution networks and the need for new investment. And then there's the other costs that families face. So I think it's right, Chris, at this time in our economy to say the economy's strong, we can bring the budget to surplus and we will, but we can also help working families at this stage through things like the school kids bonus. And I've spent a section of this afternoon sitting in the federal parliament, voting in divisions, watching the opposition try and deny working families that assistance.
Did you set the price of the carbon price too high? Will you be looking at that again?
Look, we set the carbon price based on assessments of where world pricing was and what was the appropriate price for our economy. You'd be referring to the volatility in the price in Europe. I'm not surprised that there's volatility in the price in Europe. There's volatility in all financial markets in Europe.
You won't revisit that price?
No, carbon pricing is starting on the 1st of July as legislated.
At $23?
Correct.
So no chance that'll go down. Just on some other things, your support for former Labor MP Craig Thompson went on for a long time. Was your judgment wrong on that?
Look, Craig Thompson has consistently denied the allegations about him. On Monday, what was made available to the world, we didn't see it beforehand, what was made available to the world was Fair Work Australia's conclusions in the inquiry in relation to matters involving Mr Thompson and others. It's a very disturbing report. It makes pretty disturbing reading. I don't want to see $1 of union money misused. Mr Thompson continues to deny the allegations. Ultimately, he'll have his day in court, and that's the appropriate thing.
Was it an error of judgment to put Peter Slipper in the Speaker's chair?
Well, I believe that Mr Slipper, on his performance as Deputy Speaker, had the skills to be Speaker of the House of Representatives, and I actually haven't heard criticism of his performance in keeping question time under control and those things that a Speaker needs to do. Have you heard criticism about his attitudes to entitlements over the course of 20 years? What the matter that is... Well, let's remember, this is a man who was pre-selected 9 times by his political party,
might have heard some of
and
those
the
things.
Leader of the opposition, who Mr Slipper describes as a friend, was giving him character references up to, I think it was September or October last year. So Mr Slipper, I knew in that context, 9 times supported by his political party, certainly enjoying the support of his leader very recently before he became the Speaker. Now, of course, there are a set of questions there and they need to be worked through proper processes.
Is he a fit and proper person to be Speaker?
I am not going to act as judge and jury on matters where I cannot have the facts. I mean, how would you expect me to judge that? It would be grossly unfair for me to do so.
Prime Minister, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you.